I lost my glasses yesterday. Well, I've worn these things since second grade, and it's not like I could just take them off and lay them down somewhere and walk away and not know it. But somehow I had, and I needed to get to church before USDA started. And this was my thought process. I can probably function without them for just a little while because my eyes have actually improved a little bit over the years. But before too long, I'd have this massive headache. Anybody there? Okay, and I could do some harm to my eyes, and I could probably do some harm to those around me because I'm really not supposed to drive without them. Safer not to. Our story today is about a man who tried to do without for most of his life. He's coped, he's maneuvered, he's manipulated, he's harmed himself, he's harmed others. But when we come to this story, he's in the middle of his life. He's a man in the middle of a journey. In fact, he's in the middle of lots of things. And his name was Jacob. Now, you know when I put on this veil, then I'm going to tell a story. So you take it as the Lord lays it on your heart, and we'll see what he would say to us this morning, all right? This may have the effect that my glasses did. Mercy. All right. Well, Lord, thank you. He stared at him in terror, still grasping the arms of this one who had just touched his hip and dislocated it, the weakness still working its way through Jacob's body. The man demanded, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob held, "I will not let you go until you bless me." The man asked, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. And memories began to flood through his mind. He saw himself as a twin, born to Rebekah and Isaac, who had been born to Abraham. He remembered the day his mother had told him about the Lord's words to her. The twins had thrashed about in her womb so vigorously that she had gone to the Lord to inquire about it. And the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two peoples from within you will be separated, but one will be stronger than the other. And the older will serve the younger." Esau had been born first. His name means red because he was red and hairy. But Jacob had come out grasping his brother's heel as if to say, "You may be first, but I got you." Jacob's name meant he grasps the heel. But in their native language, it was an idiom meaning one who deceives. And this would be Jacob. Esau had grown up to be a hunter. He was his father's favorite. Jacob, he was a quiet man. He spent much time in the tents with his mother, and he was her favorite. Jacob remembered clearly the day that Esau had come in from hunting. Jacob had been cooking, and maybe like you. Seeing the food, Esau said, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I am famished." But Jacob had replied, "First sell me your birthright." Now that may not mean much to you, but Esau's birthright meant more than a double share of his father's estate. And Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die. What good is the birthright to him?" And Jacob had fed him. Esau ate, drank, got up and left as if nothing of import had happened. But Jacob remembered. One day their father Isaac, who had grown weak and blind, called Esau to him and said, "I am now an old man and I don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out into the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare it like the tasty game you know I like and bring it to me to eat so that I may give you my blessing before I die." And Esau went off. He retrieved his bow, his quiver, and he went off to do his father's will. But Rebekah had heard. So she quickly prepared 2 tasty young goats, just the way Isaac liked them. She dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes, and she crafted hair coverings to cover Jacob's smooth skin, because Esau was hairy. And then she sent Jacob in to Isaac, knowing expecting that he would think it was Esau. He blessed Jacob, and he said, "May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and people bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers. May the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed. May those who bless you be blessed." And with that, Jacob had received the father's blessing intended for Esau. Esau returned to find that Jacob had deceived his father. He'd stolen now not only his birthright, but the father's blessing, and he vowed to kill Jacob as soon as his father was dead. Rebekah heard that vow too, and she prepared to send Jacob off to safety. Still scheming, she complained to Isaac about Esau's Canaanite wives and spoke of her desire for Jacob to take a wife from her family. Though none the wiser, Isaac called for Jacob and sent him off to find a wife with his blessing. "May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of people. May He give you and your descendants the blessing given to Abraham so that you may take possession of this land where you now reside as a foreigner, the land that God gave to Abraham." And off Jacob went, past the boundaries of all that he had known and grown up with, away from the inheritance he had deceived to get, and away from the wrath of his brother Esau. Alone and unsure, he finally stopped for the night, exhausted. In his dreams, he saw a stairway that started on earth but reached into the heaven, and there were angels descending and ascending upon it. And the Lord God himself was at the top of that stairway, and he said these words to Jacob, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north, to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you." Jacob awoke startled and knew that this was not just a dream, and he vowed to this God, the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, "If God will be with me and will keep me in the way that I go and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, that I will come again into my father's house in peace. Then that Lord shall be my God, and this stone that I've set up as a pillar shall be God's house. And of all you give me, I will give a full tenth to you, and you will be my God." He remembered those words. Jacob traveled on to Paddan Aram, where he found his mother's family. Laban, his mother's brother, was still alive. Laban invited Jacob to stay with them. And a month after he had been there, he came to him and he said, "You've been working for me for free. Name your wages." And Jacob stammered, confessing that he had fallen in love with Jacob's youngest daughter, Rachel. But having nothing to offer as a bride price, he proposed to Laban, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel." Well, Laban had agreed. Done. The 7 years flew by. At the end of it, almost to the day, at Jacob's prompting, Laban threw a huge feast, and Jacob was married. But when he awoke the next morning, it was Leah, Rachel's older and not so comely sister, who was in his bed. Furious, he accused Laban of deceiving him. "How could you deceive me in such a way?" And Laban responded, "Oh, that's our custom. The oldest has to be married first. Spend the rest of the week with Leah, and I'll throw in Rachel, and you can work for me for another 7 years." Jacob agreed. Anything to have Rachel as his wife. Leah started having children immediately, 4 sons, while Rachel, on the other hand, had none. As was the custom in the Middle East, a maid could be given to the husband to bear children in place of the wife, and so desperate for children, Rachel gave her maid to Jacob. and 2 sons were born to Bilhah. Jacob overheard Rachel's boast the night the second son was born. These were her words. She said, I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won. And so she named that son Naphtali, which means my struggle or my wrestling. Leah, in the meantime, had stopped bearing children, and so seeing that, she gave her maid Zilpah to Jacob, and she too had 2 children. And Leah had 2 more sons and a daughter, and finally Rachel gave birth to a son, Joseph. Were you counting? 11 sons and a daughter. And at that point, Jacob went to Laban shortly after Joseph's birth, and he said, send me on my way so that I can go back to my homeland. But Laban talked him into remaining with him in his household. And he said, Jacob, I have learned by divination that I'm being blessed because of your presence. Name your wages. That should sound familiar. And Jacob said, well, I'd like to do something for my household. Let me go through the herds and take every speckled and spotted sheep and goat and the dark-colored lambs. They'll be my wages. And that way there's no question and no possibility of me stealing from you. You can see it in the state of the flocks. Laban says, done. And while Jacob is out working the next day, he takes all the speckled and spotted sheep and all the goats and all those dark-colored lambs, and he sends them to a pasture 3 days away with his sons. Recognizing Laban's deceit, Jacob resorted to a superstition to set the matter right. He put branches that had parts of their bark peeled away in the water trough of the sheep and the goats, and sure enough, speckled goats and spotted sheep were born. And later, the Lord let him know that it was really him that had given Jacob favor. It didn't have anything to do with that bark. And he did it because he had seen what Laban had done to Jacob. You understand what that also means. Enjoying the favor of God, Jacob grew wealthy. He had large flocks of sheep and goats. He'd bought and sold them to get camels and donkeys and servants. But others had noted Jacob's too, and they weren't so happy about it. Laban's sons were incredibly jealous at Jacob's good fortune, and Laban seemed to be unhappy as well. And Jacob noticed the difference in their attitude toward him. Asking God, the Lord said to him, go back to the land of your fathers, the land of your relatives. And he said, Jacob, I will be with you. Jacob conferred with Rachel and Leah. They agreed to his plans, seeing no hope and no future in that place. And so when Laban was out shearing his sheep in that pasture land that was 3 days away, Jacob and Leah and Rachel and their servants and all their herds, all their possessions took off to go back home. 3 days later, Laban heard about it. He gathered his sons and his other relatives, and he headed off after them. 6 days later, almost to Jacob's campsite, Laban stopped for rest, and there he had a dream. And God came to him in that dream, warning Laban to be very careful about what he said to Jacob, not saying anything good and not saying bad. Laban, being Laban, finding Jacob and his family the next day, immediately accused Jacob of deceiving him. Go figure. Carrying off his daughters like captives in a war, he demanded, why didn't you tell me? Then I could have sent you off with singing and with joy. You didn't even let me kiss my granddaughters goodbye. You've done a foolish thing, and I have the power to harm you. But last night, the God of your father appeared to me. He didn't finish that statement. And in the next breath, he accused Jacob of stealing from him. He searched over and over all through Jacob's tents until finally Jacob had had enough, and he stopped Laban, full of righteous anger, furious at the injustice of Laban's accusation. He reminded how he had cared for all his flocks absorbing Laban's losses himself, how he had worked day and night for 20 years, 14 for his wives and 6 for all of his flocks. And he said, Laban, during that time you changed my wages 10 times. And if the God of my father and the God of Abraham had not been with me, you'd have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen it, and last night he rebuked you. Laban, being Laban, looked him straight in the face and he said, everything here is mine. My daughters, my children, my flocks, it's all mine. And then he looked at Rachel and Leah standing by Jacob. And he said, but what can be done about these daughters of mine? Let's make a covenant between us. So they worked all afternoon and they piled up this huge heap of rocks. And they made an oath to each other as they stood around those rocks, promising that they would not go past that heap of rocks to harm each other. They ate a meal together, and in the morning, Laban blessed his daughters and their children, and he left peacefully. So there was peace back there. But ahead of Jacob lay Esau. That night, God allowed Jacob to once again see his angels. And buoyed up by that assurance, Jacob sent word to Esau saying, I've been staying with Laban and have remained there until now. I have herds and servants. I'm hoping to find favor in your eyes. But the servants returned with the message that Esau himself was coming out to meet him and that he had 400 men with him. Terrified now, Jacob divided all of his possessions in half, hoping that if one half was attacked, the other half would survive. And then he prayed, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives and I'll make you prosper. I'm unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness that you've shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I've become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau. For I'm afraid he'll come and attack me and also the mothers and their children. But you've said, I will surely make you prosper and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. Not content, perhaps in response to his prayer, Jacob spent the first part of that evening preparing a gift for Esau, herds of goats and sheep, camels, cows, and donkeys, and he put a servant in charge of each of them, telling them to speak these words to Esau. They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift to my lord Esau, and Jacob is coming behind us. For Jacob thought, I will pacify him with these gifts I'm sending ahead. Later, when I see him, perhaps he will receive me. The rest of that evening, he had his wives and children and all the rest of his possessions ferried across the Jabbok River, and he stayed on the other side. Alone again. A man in the middle of his journey, he fought one who looked like a man all night long. As a man, he couldn't prevail against Jacob. But all of a sudden, he simply touched Jacob's hip bone. Jacob stared at him in terror, grasping the arms of this one who had just touched his hip and dislocated it, the weakness still working its way through Jacob's body. The man demanded, let me go, for it is daybreak. And for Jacob, light had truly begun to dawn. And he howled, I will not let you go until you bless me. The man said, what is your name? Jacob. He spat out, recognizing the truth of it. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. It's a name that means one who struggles with man and with God and truly overcomes. The name also means a God-governed man or a prince with God. His now in every sense. Jacob responded, "Please tell me your name." But he already knew this changeless one, this one whom he now saw very differently. He named that place Peniel, which means I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. You know that story, do you not? Or do you? Jacob wrestled with God as if he were a man, not only in this passage, but through most of his life until this point. As a man, Jacob could manipulate, he could bargain like Rachel, he could win, he could overcome. They're the same words, same meaning, same empty victory. You see Jacob's thoughts about God and his words. He thinks he can barter with him. If you'll keep me in the way I go, if you'll do these things, then I will. But coming to this part of his journey, Jacob's idea about God had to change. Having done all he could do to prepare to meet this one whom he had deceived, no longer in the right and on the right side of that blessing, Jacob needed a bigger God than he had recognized God to be. And he finds him in one who could disable him with a simple touch. One of whom he can proclaim, I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. You know, that's true of us. We can journey so far with our idea of God, we might even be blessed by him. But at some point, we need a God who is bigger than us. Like Jacob, we need a God who has the ability to keep his promises even when we haven't kept ours. He had faithfully taken Jacob in the way that he had gone. He had provided bread to eat and clothing to wear, just as Jacob had asked. The only promise that he had left unfulfilled was to take him back home in peace. But in order for Jacob to be in peace, there had to be peace in Jacob's heart. You know, for us to be at peace, there has to be peace in our heart. The only way that peace comes is in recognizing who we are, in recognizing who we've been, and seeing that God who knows who we can be. That's who Jacob met that day. The God who saw as he could be. I wonder if you know that God today. Jacob thought his blessing was going to come through earthly means. He schemed, he deceived, he did harm for a blessing that was really already his. Think about those things. I wonder today if you know the blessing that God has in store for you. The more that he wants to reveal himself to be to you. That would be the question that I would leave for you as you wrestle with this God. Amen.